Devil's been busy in your backyard. He sure has, friends. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner, and our engineer is Anita Brockington. Returning to our show for the 17th time tonight is Dr. Robert M. Schoch, a true trailblazer. Dr. Schoch, for 29 years I've been interviewing, ever since being introduced to him by our mutual friend, John Anthony West. And as an aside, I say thanks also to my dear friend who's passed on, Christopher Bird, author of The Secret Life of Plants, for first giving me a whole bunch of John Anthony West's books to give to other people. Now, we are dedicating tonight's program to Robert's father, Milton R. Schoch, who passed away earlier this week on May 14th due to complications related to COVID-19, which exacerbated other health issues. We know Milton was very proud of his son's work, especially his appearance on the Emmy Award-winning documentary, The Mystery of the Sphinx. I think I've watched that around 10 times. And we wish him well on his trip to the stars. Now, because we have 2 hours with Robert Schoch tonight, I'm going to give you a longer version of his bio. This is a very accomplished scholar that we're going to be talking to again. So even this is abbreviated. Robert M. Schoch, Ph.D., earned his doctorate in geology and geophysics at Yale, and since 1984 has been a full-time faculty member at Boston University. In addition to his teaching duties, Schoch serves as the director of the newly established Institute for the Study of the Origins of Civilization at Boston University's College of General Studies. In the early 1990s, Schoch stunned the world with his geological analysis of the Great Sphinx of Egypt, demonstrating that the monument, as well as the walls of its enclosure, bear the scars of extreme water, weathering, and erosion. As Egypt has known extremely arid climate conditions for the past 5 millennia, Schoch concluded that the origins of the monument date to an earlier epoch, a time before the Sahara Desert, and therefore is not Egyptian per se, but the monument of a previously unidentified civilization. Now, this threw a major monkey wrench into the orthodox view of the rise of civilization. And I would like to add here that I'm so proud of our little radio show, 21st Century Radio, because we were the first public forum on which Dr. Schoch made his announcement about redating the Sphinx. He first appeared on our show together with John Anthony West in May of 1991. I think John Anthony West joined us about 8 times. Well, Dr. Robert Schoch's courageous assertions about the very ancient age of the Sphinx have now been confirmed by the discovery of the 12,000-year-old megalithic complex of Göbekli Tepe in the southeastern Turkey. We'll talk about this astounding, sophisticated site tonight that, together with other new discoveries, have led Dr. Schoch to push the origin of the Great Sphinx back to the end of the Earth's last ice age. We'll also be talking a lot tonight about the non-profit organization called Oracle, which stands for the Organization for Research of Ancient Cultures, and the documentary film they are currently producing called Civilization Before Civilization. And one more thing. I want to say hello and thank you to Catherine Ulysses, or Katie, Dr. Schoch's wife and partner, with whom he travels the world in their pursuit of a deeper understanding of humanity's past. In addition to contributing substantially to the ancient civilization research, Katie is responsible for all the social media and their website, robertschoch.com. Schoch is spelled S-C-H-O-C-H. I just discovered her newly published paper in the NGCR called Does the Water Bearer Bring Forth a River of Fire? And I spent all morning reading it and thinking about it. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Dr. Robert Schoch.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you.
Phil.
And I know Katie appreciates that also.
Oh, she is wonderful. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
She is so much like my wife in the sense that she gets deeply into your work and understands it like no other person. And it's that kind of support you really need, because when you're sticking your neck out, and I've stuck my neck out a few thousand times, and I know what that feels like when just about everyone else is saying that can't possibly be.
Yeah, no, it's very important to have, I think, a supportive spouse. Very, very important.
Indeed. Well, let's start with a summary of your recent filming expedition to Turkey. You returned in January of this year, just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Tell us about it, please.
Well, yeah, we were glad because, in fact, it was, I guess, starting to hit the coronavirus as we were still in Turkey, but we didn't even know about it. Yes, so we were in Turkey in January. We were there primarily to do filming, looking at three primary areas in Turkey. One is the Cappadocia region, also known as Cappadocia, but Cappadocia is how they tend to pronounce it in Turkey, which is the area of the incredible underground cities. Many people have probably heard about that, heard about the cities. You have things like Göbekli and Kuyu. Those are two of the most famous because they're open to the public at times for people to go down and see them. But you have these incredible underground cities that could hold thousands of people literally at one time. And they play, I'm convinced, they play a very big part of the story that we are piecing together, in that these were refuges. These were places where people could survive the events at the end of the last ice age, the calamities at the end of the last ice age. I know my critics will say, but they were used in Roman times. They were used in Greek times. That is absolutely true, but they go back to a much earlier period. What we're finding is that so many of these sites have their origins, have their beginnings, have their initial usage earlier, and then they were reused, understandably, for thousands of years later. The same with what I found in terms of the Sphinx being used later and reused. So one place we went was Göbekli, and more generally the underground cities in the Cappadocia region. We went there specifically to film for the new documentary that we are working on. And when I say we, as you mentioned, it's the Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures, or ORCUL for short. And I'm very happy to say, too, that our director of photography is Bill Cote, who is the person who was the director of The Mystery of the Sphinx that John Anthony West and I did. What aired on NBC back in 1993. I know you remember it.
I watched it 400
times.
And
won an Emmy Award. So we're really serious about this. This is we want to make just as good or better a documentary this time around.
Would you describe the documentary you're working on and the not-for-profit organization you have?
Yes.
Can you say a little bit more about ORCUL? Because obviously we would love to see everyone is listening tonight contribute to this cause.
Oh, I hope they will. I mean, I don't want to sound the wrong way, but I very much believe in the project, and we do need to raise more funds. So I didn't even finish with Turkey. We were there in January. I was mentioning the underground cities in Cappadocia. That was one major location we visited specifically to film. The second one was a place called Çatalhöyük, and Çatalhöyük is interesting because it is later, it's post-Ice Age, but it's still incredibly old. It goes back to maybe 6,000 BC, so 8,000, let's just say roughly 8,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. But what you see there is the decline from what you see earlier at the end of the last Ice Age. And what I mean by that, to describe Çatalhöyük, it's an example of a number of sites of that period in time where you simply have mud brick structures, you don't have megalithic architecture, You don't have refined sculptural work, which you have earlier. And one of the places where you have it earlier, which is the last location we focused on in January in Turkey, is, of course, Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe, which goes back 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age, has incredible stonework, has huge pillars and columns that some of them are 4.5 meters tall or so, weigh 10, 15 tons, beautiful sculptures, incredibly sophisticated, and much more sophisticated than was supposed to be the case according to the conventional paradigm, according to the conventional status quo thinking. And as you mentioned in the introduction, when I start talking about the Sphinx going back to a very early period, 30 years ago, 29, 30 years ago now, I mean, my academic colleagues, they were livid. They went crazy. They said, that can't be. Civilization doesn't go back so far. Show me other evidence. Well, now we have other evidence that's independent, well-dated, goes back 12,000 years. That's Göbekli Tepe. So we wanted to get a good camera crew there, film on location, discuss it on location. So those were the three areas that we were focusing on in January for filming for the documentary. And the organization is the Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures. And as you mentioned, the website is Oracul, which is ORACUL online, all one word, oraculonline.org. Or people can reach the website through my website, which is Robert Schoch, and that's spelled SCHOCH.com. And something I'm very excited about is that we have a lot of work to do to finish the documentary, but we did put together a trailer, and I hope that people will go and see the trailer. It's just slightly under 3-minute trailer based on our work in Turkey. And the easiest way to see the trailer is just go to my website, and the first major button there will take you to the trailer, which is on YouTube. And from YouTube, if you look at the description, people can get more information by going to the Oracle website. There's a link in the description, the expanded version of the description under the trailer YouTube posting. And just a couple of words about Oracle. It is a not-for-profit 501c3. It's a legal entity, and we are raising money not just to do the documentary, but also to do field projects, to do field work. We have a lot of goals and ambitions. And last year we did 2 big trips to Egypt, which were open to the public. People had to, pay their way. But we did 2 big, very successful educational trips to Egypt. I feel like I'm very much following in the footsteps of John Anthony West, who, of course, did trips to Egypt. In fact, I took his last trip when he was very sick and could not do it himself. So it's a not-for-profit, and we have an educational aspect, we have a research aspect, and we have a publication, which includes things like documentary aspect to the organization.
Well, I certainly would love for every one of our listeners tonight to donate to it. We've donated to it, and we're going to donate to it again and again and again to try to make sure.
And I want to thank you personally for all of your support. With both this project and just over the years. I mean, you're absolutely right. It was on this radio show that I first talked about my work on the Sphinx. And I appreciate that you gave me an airing, and I just really appreciate all your support over the years, over the decades now.
Well, who knows? We might have known each other in more than just one life, John.
That's quite conceivable.
Robert. I thought I was talking to John there. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hey, it's time for a break here on 21st Century Radio. Our guest, of course, is Dr. Robert Schoch. New research being posted at robertschoch.com, including God and the Sun, the writing at Göbekli Tepe. Boy, I fell off my chair when I read that stuff. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
I'm John Anthony West, author of Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, and the leader of Magical Egypt Tours to Egypt. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Robert, we talked about a bit about this on your last appearance on 21st Century Radio, but this finding really ties things together. Tell us about the ancient Egyptian goddess, I'm going to maybe mispronounce this, is it Mehit?
Oh, Mehit, yeah.
Oh,
Mehit or Mehit.
Mehit.
Well, you don't need to worry about mispronouncing because no one really knows how the names were pronounced.
Oh, good. Okay, so I can still get an A.
You can still get an A.
All right.
Because we don't really know the vowels. People argue about it. So that we can say Mehit or Mehit. But what is really interesting about her is that the Sphinx was she. The Sphinx was Mehit. The Sphinx was Mehit. The Sphinx was originally a lioness. Now, I just heard, did I hear John Anthony's voice come through a few minutes ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Uncle John joined us a couple times.
It was good to hear him again. But something that we talked about at length, and you and I have talked about this, John Anthony West, we used to discuss this when we did Mystery of the Sphinx. We speculated, and I speculated since I first saw the Sphinx, that it was originally a lion. That because the head is too small, the head is a later head, the head has been recarved. It was not that is not the original head on the Sphinx. There's no doubt. There's been no doubt in my mind about that ever since I first looked at the Sphinx with a geological eye back in 1990. It's not the original head. So what was the Sphinx originally? And we speculated a lion, but what we've now found, and the person who inspired this and first made the discovery was a colleague of mine, Dr. Manu Safzadeh, who presented this to myself and Robert Bouval a few years ago, and we could see right away he was onto something and was correct about this, is that the Sphinx was the lioness, the goddess Mehit or Mehit. And it's not just speculation. It turns out, and this is what Manu Safzadeh found, it turns out that there are ancient inscriptions, hieroglyphic inscriptions, that refer to what we have determined is absolutely what we now call the Sphinx, but it's referring to this statue on the Giza Plateau, this huge statue, as guarding an archive. And it was Mehit, the goddess, guarding this archive. And in the ancient inscription, she literally has what we've now determined, Dr. Manu Safzadeh actually initially determined, is a key sticking out of her back. Yeah. So there were nobles and there were officials who held the title of being the master of the key of the goddess to the archives or to the records, or we could say Hall of Records as Edgar Cayce referred to it. And if you remember, and some of your listeners may realize this, back in the early 1990s, Thomas DeBecke, a geophysicist, and myself, I have a degree in geology and geophysics, we actually discovered seismically by doing seismic testing that there is a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx. And we had no doubt whatsoever, based on the signatures, the seismic signatures, that this is an artificial chamber. But what is it? Edgar Cayce, and I didn't even know about Edgar Cayce. Well, I knew who he was, but I didn't know about his comments on this subject until long after we discovered that chamber seismically. But he suggested there was a Hall of Records under or near the Sphinx. And it turns out these ancient Egyptian inscriptions say the same thing, but they're referring to what we now call the Sphinx as the goddess Mehet or Mehit. Furthermore, and this is a very important point, some of those records, some of those inscriptions go back to the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions we have, well before the traditional date of 2500 BC that the Egyptologists give to the Sphinx. The Egyptologists say that the Sphinx was not carved out of the rock until 2500 BC. We have inscriptions that go back at least 500 years earlier referring to this structure, the Proto-Sphinx. How can that be unless it was there already? Mm-hmm. Furthermore, in the context of those inscriptions, it's very evident that they are referring circa 3000 BC to a much older structure still, something that was ancient to them. So all of a sudden, in my opinion, it all fits together. The ancient dynastic Egyptians were referring to a much older structure, which at that time they knew of as the goddess Mehit, which was later then transformed into the Sphinx when the head was recarved from a lioness head, a female lion, to a human head to turn it into a Sphinx with a human head, body of a lion. And they knew that there was an archive underneath, a chamber underneath, that this statue and this goddess were, and still do, she still does, in my opinion, guard that chamber, which we've not seen entered in modern times.
This is so fascinating, really. I understand you have found evidence of major ancient lightning strikes or electrical plasma strikes from an ancient active sun right in the Giza Plateau.
Absolutely. This is really interesting, too, and it ties in with this story because something that I'm convinced of, based on all the evidence that's coming together and has come together, is that the Ice Age ended 9700 BC. That's the modern dating based on ice cores and sediment cores. A lot of data is confirming that the Ice Age ended very suddenly in 9700 BC, give or take 5 years, and that it was not a comet or asteroid or anything like that. It was a solar event. It was a huge solar outburst. So when we're talking about lightning, we can use that term generally to either refer to small atmospheric lightning from a thunderstorm, that type of thing, or what's known as plasma, electrically charged particles that come from outer space that would come from our sun during a major solar outburst. When you have major solar flares, what are known as coronal mass ejections, things like that. And this happened in 9700 BC, ending the last ice age. And since I've been talking about this for the last decade plus, we've now found evidence that the sun is much more unstable, much more active than anyone suggested. There have been smaller incidents since 9700 BC. Getting back to the plateau, the Giza Plateau, I have found now physical evidence on the Giza Plateau of burnt and charred and what's known as vitrified rock, where it was hit by lightning or hit by the plasma strikes, melted the rock very quickly, and then it congeals, and it congeals as essentially a natural glass. That's what's known as vitrification. This is something that you find around the world in certain contexts because the entire world was hit. And it was, in many cases, very mysterious, but it's all making sense now that it dates back to that time period. There were probably incidents where it happened even earlier in time. Things tend to repeat themselves geologically, but we have it on the Giza Plateau. I've been able, on the last trip to Egypt last year, I spent about 6 weeks in Egypt giving the tours and also doing my own research. In some of the shafts at Giza, you can go down the shafts numerous meters, and you can actually trace these essentially remnants of the vitrified rock that go down into it. So this is not something where people were just building a fire on the surface and it charred the rock a little bit. It's absolutely from a very, very strong strike. Now, interestingly, and this is an important component of the story, the inventory stela. There's something known as the inventory stela that was also found at Giza. It was found in what's known as the Temple of Isis at Giza near the Great Pyramid. And this inventory stela, which is now in the Cairo Museum, when you read the inscription on it, it says that the Sphinx was struck by lightning and that it actually damaged the Sphinx. And there's actually a fissure in the back of the Sphinx where it divided the Sphinx essentially into two, and I think that may have been caused by that strike. So we have a situation where the ancient Egyptians in dynastic times themselves were talking about this older statue, this what we now call the Sphinx, having been hit by lightning, and Khufu from the Old Kingdom times actually went to venerate and to see the damage to the Sphinx, which I believe had happened much, much earlier, and acknowledged it. So they were talking about this. Now, in modern times, most Egyptologists to this day say, oh, this is all just a myth. They were just making things up. But in fact, it fits the physical evidence that we can now recognize on the Giza Plateau. It fits the concept of the Sphinx being much earlier, that the Egyptians were saying that was much older than their civilization, that it was essentially a remnant of an earlier civilization going back thousands of years earlier. As John Anthony West liked to say, why can't we believe what the Egyptians said about their own history? Maybe they knew a little bit more about it than modern Egyptologists, rather than modern Egyptologists just dismissing what they had to say. So I think it's very exciting times and really confirms what I've been talking about for a very long time.
Indeed, in great detail it does. I paint. I'm an artist, as you know. I painted a bust that went up to Woodstock that became world-renowned. And on one side of it, the driver's side, is a very large Sphinx, the Egyptian Sphinx.
Oh, that's right, yes.
So when we sent you some we're going to be sending you some propaganda on that because we had just recreated the bust and took it up to Woodstock for the 50th anniversary, and it was terrific. Being able to talk
wonderful.
about. So that
the Sphinx gets around.
Yeah, the Sphinx gets around and has its own story. I mean, this is
exactly. Yes. Exactly. Well, I think the Sphinx, everyone recognizes the Sphinx. Sphinx has to be one of the most iconic, wouldn't you say, iconic symbols on Earth.
Oh, yes, indeed.
So that's so wonderful.
Well, would you please there's time out on the playing field here. That's right. Dr. Kortner told me we got to take time out here on the playing field, and we're doing pretty good. We got a couple of home runs, and our guest, Robert Schoch, is striking them out left and right. So this is 21st Century Radio, and when we return, Dr. Robert Schoch will be talking some more about maybe the Sphinx, but also a solar-induced dark age is what we're going to do on that one, okay?
Hello, this is Ingo Swann, the author of Penetration, The Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy. And you're listening to the wonderful 21st Century Radio with the amazing Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Oh, what a dear friend of mine who passed on as well. He had a good time in this life. He did a lot of good. Our guest is Dr. Robert Schoch, and here's the big question for $30,000 if you can answer it. Ready? You ready?
Am I?
Yeah, that's right. This is a
for me.
Yeah, this is a $30,000 question you're going to get, and who knows if you make it, then it's going to help. Ready? Here goes.
Okay, yeah.
All right.
Well, don't make it too hard then.
Well, oh, come on. Okay, all right. Okay. Explain the concept of the solar-induced dark age, or SIDA. How does this tie in with your concept of multiple cycles of civilization? Try to take that one on.
Oh, that's easy.
Oh, yeah, are you cheating?
Well, it's easy, but
what,
long,
are you reading your book and cheating?
Explanation, maybe. Oh, okay. Before I get to that, I just wanted to mention that Katie was just showing me, because we supported your campaign for the bus.
That's correct.
She's got her bus T-shirt on.
Way to go! Congratulations.
Yeah, she just got that and got that out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
It's a pretty shirt, isn't it?
It is. It's really beautiful.
And it has. Does it see this? Can you see the Sphinx on it? I think the part of the Sphinx is. Nope. My boss is saying no. Well, that's good.
No, but it's a beautiful shirt.
Would you like one too?
Sure.
Great. Put it down on the list, Courtner. Okay.
No, but that's wonderful, and the buses. I mean, mobile Sphinx. I can't talk now. Mobile Sphinx. Sphinx gets around.
Yeah, we get it around.
Yeah. So anyway, SIDA. SIDA ties in with the Sphinx. SIDA stands for Solar-Induced Dark Age, and this ties in with the big story that we had civilization, what I call a cycle of civilization or a round of civilization that flourished at the end of the last ice age. And I'm not talking in terms of hyperbole. I'm not talking metaphorically. I am saying that all the evidence now indicates that this was genuine civilization, as good as any civilization that we've ever seen. And let me explain that. John Anthony West used to say that he held early dynastic civilization as the model of what civilization should be, as far as the people and, the purpose of the civilization. And yes, of course, they had their problems, they had their wars, etc., but they also had what he believed was a really profound philosophy and a concept of the sacred, etc. And before he passed away, we were starting to learn together about Göbekli Tepe, and I have been looking at that and exploring it more ever since, and I'm convinced that we have at Göbekli Tepe, and with the proto-Sphinx, I'll call it that, with Mehit, the goddess who was the Sphinx, or was to become the Sphinx later, we have evidence in both Egypt and in Turkey, and I believe we're developing evidence elsewhere on Earth that before the end of the last ice age, before 9700 BC, there was also genuine civilization on this planet. Advanced people, advanced technologies, advanced and sophisticated knowledge. We have physical evidence for this with the megalithic structures that they left behind, that they left for us to find. We now have evidence of writing. I'm convinced at Göbekli Tepe. We can talk about that maybe in the second hour. We have evidence of them being settled, not just being hunter-gatherers, as I learned as an undergraduate and graduate student, you had 10,000 BC. No, there were very sophisticated people back then. What happened to them? They were wiped out. They were devastated by the natural catastrophes that brought the Ice Age to an end in 9700 BC. What caused the Ice Age to end was the sun. It was solar-induced. So what we have is an early cycle of civilization represented by the people who carved the original Proto-Sphinx, the statue Mehit. There's an archive under her which may, to this day, hold their records. We have evidence with Göbekli Tepe of this early cycle of civilization. It was devastated at 9700 BC, and for 6,000 years, there was essentially a dark age. Again, this is Siddha, the solar-induced dark age, and that ties in with Turkey and the January trip. Not only were we looking at evidence at Göbekli Tepe for the height of this early civilization, but we were also looking at Cappadocia, the underground cities where people had to seek refuge during this dark age. We were looking at Çatalhöyük, another site which is representative of what people were thrown back to, or how civilization was devastated, and they went to a, quote, more primitive state for 6,000 years. And in about 3,000 BC, 3,500 BC, thereabouts, it was not that civilization suddenly arose on Earth, but it re-emerged. It was sparked, sort of like a renaissance, by people, I think, in part rediscovering their past, just as the European Renaissance rediscovered the ancient Greeks and Romans, and this sparked a new heightened civilization, or a new heightened technological and art and other things. The same thing happened on a larger scale. So it was not that civilization first emerged about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, but it re-emerged after a very long dark age.
Did the sun bring the last ice age to a sudden end?
Yeah, it was absolutely the sun that brought that last ice age to an end. We have, from isotope data from Greenland in particular, you can look at what's called microstratigraphy, look at isotopes which are proxy for weather conditions, weather patterns on Earth. You can look at certain isotopes which are a proxy for solar activity. When I say proxy, it measures solar activity because when the sun is more active, you get certain isotopes in the atmosphere which then fall out into the layers of ice. The same with sediment cores. You can pick it up there too. So you can measure these things, and right now, the end of the last ice age can literally be measured not just to the year, but to a fraction of a year. And all the evidence indicates it literally happened within a couple of weeks to overnight. And this is absolutely in keeping with the sun undergoing a major solar outburst, what some people are now calling a micronova or a mini-nova, that blasted and fried the Earth, to use a term that Paul LaVioletta has used, or has been used in conjunction with some of the research. He's done research on this also, and made a very strong case for it as well, that the Earth was essentially fried at the end of the last ice age. So this is why you have incredible temperature rises literally overnight, virtually overnight. You have the glaciers melting at high latitudes very, very, very quickly, virtually instantaneously. You have things like the lightning strikes or the plasma strikes on the Giza Plateau, where the solar outburst sent out charged particles, electrons and protons, etc., that impacted the Earth, drove down to the surface in some cases. An astronomer, or actually I should call him astrophysicist, Thomas Gold, talked about this as a possibility back in the 1960s, because he found evidence of this on the moon with the first Apollo missions going to the moon and gathering rock samples. He found vitrification or glazing. He found where the rock had melted and recongealed, and he suggested at the time this was because of a major solar outburst. which we would now date to the end of the last ice age, he was basically ignored because people couldn't believe it. It wasn't within their realm of thought, should we say.
They couldn't think out of the box.
That the sun would explode like that. Yet he had the evidence back then, and we're finding more and more evidence. All the evidence is suggesting this is what happened.
Well, what can we expect from our sun in the relatively near future? Is a major solar outburst or mini-nova a real possibility?
It's not only a real possibility, but I think it has to happen. It's going to happen. Now, I'm not saying exactly when, and I really don't like being the bearer of news like this, but if you look at the evidence, you look at the science, it's going to happen sooner than later. Could it happen? I honestly believe there are people listening to this radio program who will be alive when it happens, and I'm hoping that includes myself, honestly, because I'd like to see it. But I think it's very imminent in that sense. So I'm talking geologically imminent, but when I say geologically, will I be surprised if it happens in the next decade? Not at all. I really hate sounding that way, but this is what the evidence says, because when you look at the data, the sun was very, very active, very volatile at the end of the last ice age. And I want to point out one very important thing here. Some people are talking about how the sun is going into a dormant period. It's becoming very inactive at the moment, and there is a lot of truth to that sunspots are going down. It seems to be going into a low or dormant period. That is exactly when it may undergo a major solar outburst. So in 1859, the sun was sort of in a very low period of activity generally, and then all of a sudden there were two huge coronal mass ejections that were thrown out. They were very small compared to what happened at the end of the last ice age, but they still hit the Earth. They caused the telegraph system to go crazy. It actually burnt out some of the telegraph stations, that type of thing. It caused a lot of damage to the telegraph system. But that was 1859. The only electronics that people were using, or the only electrical systems really, were the telegraph system. That was just for the very wealthy and some government officials. Most people didn't know anything happened. If the same thing happens today, it will destroy the modern technological society that we live in, potentially. It will bring down our electrical grid systems. It will bring down our satellite systems. It could damage nuclear power plants, and we have Fukushimas left and right. We have set ourselves up to be very, very vulnerable, and I feel horrible saying all this, but I think we have to face the truth.
Well, I did a mural at Johns Hopkins University that told the same story.
Well, so we're thinking the same way. Tell me about the mural.
Yeah, let me send you a whole booklet on it.
Okay, great.
It deals literally with the loss of our democracy and how that came about, and what the response was in the kind of war that comes after that. This is the rise and fall of civilization in a way. But, the sun seems to me to have consciousness. How is that stupid?
No, it's not at all. In fact, there is so much evidence that the sun and the stars and whatnot. Now, it's a little tricky because I don't want to say that they are conscious like you and I are, but on the other hand, maybe they have better consciousness or a higher level of consciousness. But there's a lot of evidence that, yes, stars are conscious. This actually ties in with something that Katie first developed, that we may literally go back to the stars, go back to the sun. The ancient Egyptians believed that we went to the stars and to the sun and joined our, we'll call it consciousness, or our entities with them. And there's independent And if people are not familiar with this, it's hard to grasp at the moment. It sounds a little crazy, but there's a lot of independent evidence that stars and suns, and our sun is just another star in that sense, they are actually conscious. They actually have volition. They actually, have a level. You can't call it anything else, consciousness. Some of the aspects of how stars behave, I've read physics papers where they want to try to explain this and that. Oh, there's some weird force in dark matter or this or that causing these stars to behave in certain ways, but we can't really explain it. But if you think of the stars, I just use this as an example, if you think of them as conscious and coagulating or collecting together or moving in tandem together just like a swarm of fish does or humans do, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know if I'm making sense now.
Well, you certainly are, but unfortunately we got to pay for the show, and it's going to be time out here on the playing field. Your fastball's doing pretty good there, Robert. Our guest is Robert Schoch, Ph.D., new film in the works called Civilization Before Civilization, and we suggest strongly that you send out as much money as you possibly can to help this project along. And we'll see you next hour.